Good morning. This is New Hampshire Today. I am Chris Ryan. We are in Washington with the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. Of course, former presidential candidate, came in second in the First Nation presidential primary, close second back in 2020. And a lot of what you discussed as a candidate was the view of a government that worked better for the people. And I'm wondering, in now almost 4 years on the job, what do you see in that regard? And are there certain conflicts within how Washington works that are a hindrance to providing a government that works well for people?
Back when I was getting to know the people of New Hampshire as a candidate, I often talked about how I thought government would be well served if Washington worked a little more like our best-run cities and towns. I feel that way even more strongly now that I've had the opportunity to be here at the federal level. I think in many ways the measure of our success at, for example, the U.S. Department of Transportation is whether we are making things easier and better for local communities. One thing I've been reflecting on is as we watch the number of projects funded by the Biden infrastructure plan hit the 50,000 mark, what all of those 50,000 projects have in common is none of them was invented here at the U.S. DOT headquarters. They all came from communities. The idea was that the proposals, the projects aren't going to come from Washington, but more the funding should. And that's actually happening. So for all of the frustrations that are very real, that I feel even more strongly now that I'm involved at the federal level, something really important happened, which was bipartisan legislation to get real funding out to fix our roads and bridges and trains and transit and airports and ports, that we are now moving out across the country. The dollars are moving, the dirt is flying, the construction projects are increasingly happening. And that, to me, has been a source of optimism, even in a challenging and divided time.
When it comes to remaining connected with communities, obviously former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, have that pedigree. But in these vast federal office buildings, you could see how an individual could get disconnected from what actually matters. And is that one of the problems? And how have you and how should government function in regard to staying connected to the people and what the people desire? Because a lot of Washington, D.C., as we were talking about before, the conversation here is based upon drama. And that's what people see. They don't see necessarily government working for them. They see fighting, conflict, drama.
Yeah, you definitely look at some of what goes on Capitol Hill, and it feels like you've got members of Congress who view this place as a content farm rather than a place to get things done. But I've also been inspired by the public servants that I've gotten to know right here in this building, for example. You and I are sitting in the U.S. Department of Transportation headquarters. It is a large building, 2 buildings actually. Then again, most of the employees of this department don't sit here in Washington. They're out around the country, everywhere from air traffic control towers to the person I met in Denver yesterday from the Federal Highway Administration working to make sure I-70 gets fixed. And I'm very conscious that you can't get a job like mine done from behind a desk, which is why pretty much every week I'm out around the country somewhere. This town does have a way of looking inward sometimes, and you have to actively get out of that. But with a job like Secretary of Transportation, it really forces you to get out and about in a way that I would have wanted to do anyway, and really focus on not the ins and outs of the Washington drama or the bureaucratic process, but how it's turning into results for people. Is a road getting fixed? Is a bridge getting better? Is a flight on time and safe? And all of that comes down to what we do here and making sure that we actually make it work for people.
U.S. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg joining us here, as he mentioned, inside the U.S. Transportation headquarters in Washington. I am Chris Ryan. When you look at the differences between your administration, the Biden administration, and how it has functioned at DOT versus the Trump administration, the obvious thing to look at is it was always Transportation Week in the Trump administration, but it never actually became Transportation Week until the bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed. What are some of the other differences in terms of functionality and success?
Well, as you mentioned, probably the difference we're proudest of is the previous administration promised an infrastructure package. This administration actually delivered one. Now, let me say, across a lot of the work that we do, it's not particularly ideological. It's one of the things I like about this place. When we're figuring out how to make sure we get the most modern equipment into air traffic control towers, the last thing those controllers care about is whether the person sitting in my seat is a Democrat or a Republican. They just want to make sure that that they're going to be taken care of, that they have good equipment, that we're hiring more people to join their ranks so they're not overworked. A lot of what we do is nuts and bolts infrastructure delivery. It's not red or blue. It's just about getting stuff done. But there are definite differences in approach. One thing I would point to is that the past administration was a little more pro-corporate in terms of how they approached regulation. And a great example of this is the approach to the railroad industry. We've got 4 massive railroads that are really the largest dominant freight railroads, what are called the Class 1 freight railroads. They throw around a lot of weight in this town. And very often in the last administration, they got their way. There were a number of deregulatory actions, some of which included, in my view, a watering down of safety rules. And this department, under the last administration, actually froze the development of a rule so common sense, I think most people would assume it was already there, which was a rule on having some minimum number of people on board a freight train. So we finally we restarted that work when we got here. We finally got it through into the Federal Register just a couple of weeks ago. All we did was we said that generally when you got these freight trains, especially 1 or 2 mile long freight train, you got to have 2 human beings on it. Again, I bet most Americans assumed that's already the law. It actually wasn't until we did it. And a couple of the railroads are already suing us over this. So, that's something that probably certainly would not have happened under the last administration. It's a difference in approach. And we really believe in the approach that the Biden-Harris administration has taken here. But again, I'd say 9 times out of 10, it's really more about delivery than anything that has a red or blue color to it.
And that law, obviously, and change in response to what happened with the train derailment in Ohio. Pete Buttigieg joins us here. Obviously, a large determinant will be what happens in the upcoming election. But is this a job that you are pleased with, or would you see yourself potentially looking at another cabinet position or wanting one within the administration?
I think I've got the best job in the federal government. I mean, don't get me wrong. It is demanding, especially when we have really tough things from what we confronted when we got here with COVID, which is really, if you think about it, the biggest set of disruptions to transportation since 9/11. I mean, everything from whether our airlines were going to survive to ocean shipping all got turned upside down. We had to work through that, and then more recent and dramatic events like the collapse of that bridge in Baltimore, which I've been to now a couple of times, and just shocking to see what happened there. And the good news is it's brought out the best of people in terms of dealing with it. So it's a challenging job, but it's an immensely rewarding job because it gives me the chance to shape infrastructure that I know that my kids, who are 2 years old right now, are going to be counting on when they're well past the age that I am now.
Segued perfectly into the next question regarding the Port of Baltimore. What's new there? And it seems obviously that was the biggest story in America for several days, and that's kind of gone to the backdrop. But meanwhile, there's still a lot of work being done there. What's the latest on what functionality there is within the port, and how has that affected commerce in that area?
Yeah, right now most of the port is inaccessible. When that bridge came down, it blocked a channel that's the main way, or really the only way, to get to most of the port. Now, we've been working a lot of temporary solutions, including enhancing a facility that sits just outside of the bridge that can accommodate ship traffic, but they need to pave more there. Actually, about 10 acres, we're helping them pave to be able to be a cargo laydown area there. So we're working on a lot of temporary solutions, but really what needs to happen is the channel needs to get reopened. The Army Corps of Engineers believes that they can do this by the end of May, and actually by the end of this month have a temporary partial channel that'll allow some of that shipping to move. Once that's resolved, then I think all eyes will be on the actual bridge replacement. We're already underway. We've released the first $60 million to help Maryland get that done. It's going to take a lot more than $60 million, and it's going to take a lot more than just to the end of May. But it's very important, practically and symbolically, that we tear down all the red tape and barriers to getting that done. And I think in the end, Baltimore will be stronger than ever before. It's just not going to happen overnight.
I want to ask you about a couple of New Hampshire-related projects. Route 1A along the seacoast, one of the more beautiful roads in the country, has been dealing with flooding on a pretty continual basis. And even within that area, Hampton and several areas continue to be flooded on a consistent basis. And I'm sure this is the story of a lot of infrastructure along low-lying areas across the country. and we'll get to rail in a second. But first on 1A and concerns, and how does the department plan on dealing with flooding, which kind of happens on a continual basis, it appears now.
Yeah, look, sea levels are rising, storms are becoming more frequent and more severe. What used to be considered a 100-year flood is now a semi-regular event. And no matter how hard we work to slow down climate change, this is already a reality that's happening around us, so we can't pretend otherwise. That's why part of the Biden infrastructure plan was a new program called Protect. This is funding specifically for situations where you have a vulnerable piece of infrastructure like 1A, especially the way it sits between Hampton and Rye there, where just continuing to do things the way we've always done them just means you're going to get washed out again and again. So this $20 million will go toward reinforcing and strengthening that important stretch of 1A. And it's an example of projects we're doing all around the country now with funding that didn't exist before this infrastructure package, recognizing the reality that building a road, or for that matter a bridge or an airport, for the 21st century is just going to look different than the way we would have done it 50 years ago.
Piling is on rail. For years, there's been discussion of bringing commuter rail to New Hampshire, Nashua, Manchester, perhaps up to Concord, but it's continually been met with opposition from Republicans within the State House. What's the latest on that, and do you anticipate money being available for rail study, which in the past also has been rejected by Republicans in the State House, for commuter rail in New Hampshire?
We believe in commuter rail. We believe in passenger rail. President Biden famously commuted on Amtrak, so he's passionate about it. I am too, because I've seen the economic potential that comes with good rail service, and has a lot of benefits in terms of reducing congestion and in terms of air quality. So it is a mode of travel that America is investing in more under President Biden. I know there's a lot of interest in what commuter rail could mean for New Hampshire, and we stand ready to link local visions with sources of funding that have grown under this administration, including our Federal Transit Administration's capital investment program and others that could be a source of support for planning and potentially for construction. But I'll come back to what I said earlier on, which is none of our projects that we're funding are projects that we cook up here at the headquarters. The project ideas have to come locally. They have to have support from the state or region in order for us to be in a position to consider these applications for funding. What I'll say is, as that vision, as and when a vision comes to us from New Hampshire that has the level of support that it needs from elected officials, we're going to look for ways to be helpful because we know the difference that it could make.
Secretary Buttigieg, as always, great to see you and look forward to talking again soon.
Same here. Great being with you.
For Pete Buttigieg, I am Chris Ryan here in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Department of Transportation. This is New Hampshire Today.